Hi, and welcome to the Newbery Chronicles. This is a podcast where two people read through every Newbery Medal winning book and then we talk about it. My name's Michael.
And I'm Rebecca.
And this time, we're back in the 1920s, everyone's favorite decade for the Newbery Medal. And we've already read The Voyages of Doctor Dolittle by Hugh Lofting, which won the Newbery Medal in 1923. So this was only the second Newbery Medal winning book ever after The Story of Mankind. So it had big shoes to fill after that hulking tome. Probably my number one Newbery Medal so far is The Story of Mankind, as I'm sure it is most people's. But anyway, before we talk about Dr. Dolittle, we're going to talk about what we've been reading recently. Rebecca, would you like to go first, or shall I?
I can go. I am not going to talk about the ones that we read in 2023. There are some that I finished after we did Free Water, but we talked about some of those in our special episode. So I'll just start with what I've read this year so far. I read Maid, which is a memoir by Stephanie Land. My mother.
Is this based on what the TV show is based on?
Yeah, my mother-in-law and I watched the Netflix miniseries about this memoir a couple years ago, and I really loved it. I thought the story was inspirational. I thought the acting was superb. It's really, really good. And this memoir did not disappoint. It's really just Stephanie Land's journey through poverty and navigating the welfare system and benefits while she's raising a daughter on her own and leaving an abusive relationship and working as a maid. And she's just a very, very good storyteller. And I think she's very honest about things without, I don't know, I just think she's very honest about it without being despairing and without bogging you down when you have every reason to be bogged down. It just is really, really good, and I loved her story. I also loved reading the introduction. Sorry, my words aren't coming to me very well, but anyway, reading the introduction beforehand that explained that there was like an organization that tries to write about economic injustice and to really highlight writers who have lived that life, and that's how Stephanie Land got connected with this organization, and then they helped sponsor her to write this book. So I thought all of that was truly inspirational. She just came out with another memoir called Class. So Maid follows her story until she gets into college, and Class follows her struggle while she's in college. So I have not yet read that yet. It's on my wait list for Libby, but it's a very good book. I also read The Black Church, which is, the subtitle of that is This Is Our Story, This Is Our Song by Henry Louis Gates Jr. And that is really just a book that follows the history of the Black Church and highlights values throughout their history, and also different factions of the Black Church and like how they're informed by slavery and liberation, and talks about Dr. King and Malcolm X and other great leaders throughout their history, and that book was very good. I read Between Two Kingdoms, which is a memoir by Suleika Jawad, and that follows her journey through cancer, and that book was a very heavy read.
That's another memoir.
But very good, and I found out, so the end of this memoir ends with how she's in remission and everything, and I found out that she's now has cancer again, which is truly devastating, but she's a very talented author. And then I read Hang the Moon by Jeanette Walls, which is her only novel. I've read her, I don't know if it's her only novel. It's the only novel of hers that I've read. I think it's the only one that she's written. I have read her nonfiction and really loved it. I will say I did not love this as much as I have loved her nonfiction. I felt so she also, this is a historical fiction that's written in the 20s about some bootleggers in rural Appalachian Virginia. So it's a very interesting premise. I think there is a lot going on in this novel, too much for her to really deal with well. but I still like Jeanette Walls. So that's what I've read.
Okay. Nice. Well, I don't have so many. And for once, I'm not reading multiple books at the same time, because for a long time we've been reading Setri by Cormac McCarthy, but as we talked about last episode, we finished it. So now I'm just back to one book at a time. And the one book that I read recently, besides The Voyages of Doctor Dolittle, literally just finished it within the last hour of us recording this, is this book called Half American by Matthew F. Delmont, which Rebecca actually got me for Christmas. And basically it's about, it's a nonfiction book. It's about the role of African Americans in World War II, and also the effect of World War II on African Americans. And so it basically contextualizes it within, like, as a preamble to the civil rights movement, which I think, like, a lot of people, I mean, like, people like, what's his name? Go Tell on a Mountain. James Baldwin. Sorry, I don't know why I forgot who James Baldwin was. People like James Baldwin have basically said that, like, basically that, like, the conditions that Black people encountered during and immediately before and immediately after World War II were the catalyst for what eventually became the civil rights movement. And, like, a lot of people in the early civil rights movement especially were World War II veterans. And I didn't even really realize that. Like, Medgar Evers, you know, the really famous civil rights leader who was murdered, he was a veteran. A lot of them were veterans. And what this book basically tells about is, there's of course, like, the normal, like, European and Pacific theater stuff that you always hear about with World War II, but that's honestly not the focus of the book. And I was a little bit worried that it was, because I don't love just, like, reading about, like, battle maneuvers and stuff. But it doesn't really do that. What it mostly does is contextualize World War II domestically and what it meant for Black Americans. Like, it starts with the Spanish Civil War, which was a lot of people, not just Black Americans, but a lot of Americans' first engagement with conflict in Europe. And a lot of people say the Spanish Civil War is, like, the true beginning of World War II, like, before Hitler starts invading stuff, because it is the you see, like, the kind of coalescing of what would become the Axis and Allied powers around, like, the different factions in the Spanish Civil War. And so, of course, a lot of Black people, Black Americans, like other Americans and other British, you know, all sorts of international people go and fight on the Republican side of the Spanish Civil War against Franco, who of course was supported by Hitler and by Mussolini, you know, and all those good guys. And in the Spanish Civil War, because there are Black people, a lot of these Black people, it's their first experience outside of the U.S., they experience, you know, the ability to be given leadership roles and stuff like that that have been basically prohibited from them in America. And so they come back and are ready to serve in World War II, and then are basically, the army segregated for a while. Like, Black people aren't even allowed to be combatants. And, you know, this kind of sets off, like, a whole bunch of pushes to basically integrate the military, and as a result, you know, eventually leads to the integration of broader American society. Like, I didn't realize this, but one of the cases, like, court cases that was won that helped desegregate the military was cited in Brown versus Board of Education. So there's, like, a direct legal precedent in, like, the civil rights stuff that happened in World War II to, like, what we would now consider, like, the proper civil rights movement in, like, the 50s and 60s. And also, I mean, a lot of people don't contextualize World War II this way, but apparently, you know, all the Black papers did at the time was that fascism was a manifestation of Jim Crow for Black Americans. They talked about, a lot of papers would talk about Hitlerism in the U.S., and what they meant by that was, like, the segregated South and the apartheid South and all that sort of stuff. And so for a lot of these Black people, fighting fascism and you know, all that, you know, in World War II was they saw this as explicitly, like, a preamble to coming back and then fighting. They call it the double victory, right? The double victory would have been defeating fascism, racial hierarchy in Europe, and then coming back and defeating it in the United States as well. And a lot of white people didn't have that idea. In fact, Confederate flags were flown over some of the occupied German cities and stuff. So there all sorts of stuff like that. But anyway, I thought that book was really interesting, and it contextualizes World War II in a way that I think a lot of historians contextualize it as, but is not really usually thought of like in the modern like popular retellings of World War II.
Right.
So half American. It was good.
Good. I'm glad.
All right. Yeah. So now on to, speaking of race, Dr.
But real
Dolittle.
quick, just if you're a Knoxville local, I got that book at the bottom, which is a Black-owned bookstore here in Knoxville, in East Knoxville, that is really great, and they're doing some really cool things. And their shop is really cute. Like, you can just go out there and hang out. They have like a tea room, and they
do a lot of community events.
They do a lot of community events. They support local artists. It's just good vibes and
in
really
fact,
cool.
In fact, Jerry Kraft, who wrote New Kid, of Newbery Medal winning fame and of Newbery Chronicles fame, actually came and did a lecture or spoke, had an event at the bottom, and we just dropped the ball. We knew that was happening, and we were gonna try to go, and then we just forgot about it.
Yeah.
But so it's a cool place that does stuff like that.
Yeah, it's really cute. You should go. Give them your business. And that book was recommended by the staff. Like, they have like a staff recommendation section.
Thank you, staff.
Yeah. Anyway,
the Voyages of Doctor Dolittle, back in the 1920s when racism was solved.
By Dr. Dolittle himself. And we'll get to that in a minute, but it's my duty, my honor, my burden to bring you the biography of Hugh Lofting, which is actually really interesting. So this dude is English. He's British by birth. And Rebecca and I were talking about this, but we just found it interesting that the first two Newbery Medal winners were written by authors who basically had immigrated to the United States rather than were, born, quote unquote, like born American or whatever. Like, it is like an interesting quirk. And in fact, Gainek as well, which was another 1920s one that we read, was Indian American. And at any rate, it is interesting that like a lot of the early Newbery Medals were written by people who didn't grow up in the United States initially. So Hugh Lofting is born in 1886 in a place that I would consider pronouncing Berkshire, England, but I looked up the pronunciation and it's Berkshire. He didn't stay in England for long, though. He went to college at MIT in, of course, the United States, and studied civil engineering and was a civil engineer for a while. And he did a lot of stuff through engineering. So I'm just going to list out what I found. So he was an architect at one point. He was a gold prospector at one point. He was a surveyor in Canada at one point. He was a railway engineer. But by 1912, he decided he didn't really like engineering a lot. And so he started doing a lot more writing. However, in 1914, he enlisted in the military, in the British military, because he actually never became a naturalized citizen of the United States. He retained his British citizenship the whole time. So all of his enlisting was done for the British, despite at this point having lived in America for several years. And so initially he, in World War I, worked for the British Ministry of Information in the United States. But then in 1916, he actually went into the Army proper and went into combat and stuff. And, World War I was awful. And it was awful for Hugh Lofting as well. He was eventually injured and sent home in 1917. But before that, as like a way to communicate with his family, which he was married at the time and had kids, he had multiple wives at separate times, not at the same time, but
he had, over the course of his life, he had 3 wives, and I'm not sure which kids he had at which point. But he had children plural, and he was writing letters to these children. And the war was really awful, as everyone who went to World War I said it was. And he didn't really want to tell his kids about that because, it's not really kid stuff. And so he just invented stories and wrote them in his letters, and this is how he created Dr. Dolittle. And it was apparently influenced by he saw how the animals were treated by the army and he saw them basically as how the army said that the animals were basically expendable. Like if a horse was wounded, they just killed the horse, right? Instead of if a person was wounded, they would nurse this person back to health as best as they could. And he just thought this was ghastly. And so this idea came to him about what if there was this amazing doctor for animals? And so Dr. Dolittle comes out of World War I, and eventually he kind of readapts these letters into basically what made his career as a writer, which was the story of Dr. Dolittle. I want to actually read the full title of the first Dr. Dolittle book, which he published in 1920. So it was called The Story of Dr. Dolittle, being the history of his peculiar life at home and astonishing adventures in foreign parts never before printed. We just need to come back to books having those titles, Anyway, 2 years later, he wrote The Voyages of Doctor Dolittle, which does not have a subtitle, disappointingly. And eventually he wrote, if I'm counting right, he wrote 15 books centered on Doctor Dolittle. They were very popular, and not all of these books were novel length, some of them were picture books. One of them was where he goes to the moon. Another one is about Gub Gub the pig, who writes an encyclopedia about food. And anyway, I didn't realize there were so many Dr. Dolittle books. I read a couple of these as a kid, but he wrote other books too, but mostly Dr. Dolittle books. He only had one work for adults, which was a poem, a book-length poem he published that was an anti-war poem. So, still banging the drum for anti-war after his World War I experience. And honestly, I don't blame him.
No.
Anyway, in 1919, after he was discharged from the army because he was injured, he went back to the United States and settled in Connecticut, another Newbery Medal winning person in Connecticut. And I think he lived in Connecticut for a long time, but he eventually moved to California and died in California. So I'm not sure where in there he moved from Connecticut to California, but he's buried in Connecticut. So I don't know how long he was in California. Anyway, over the course of his life, he had 3 wives, 3 children. His son Christopher, who wrote the afterword for the copy of the Voyages of Doctor Dolittle that I read, and we'll get to these forwards and afterwards in a second. He is or was, I'm not sure if he's still alive, but he was in charge of the estate and had creative control over what happened with Dr. Dolittle or whatever. So we can probably blame him on that really boring 1960s Dr. Dolittle movie that he surely greenlit. Oh. And maybe the Eddie Murphy one too, which is also not very good. Anyway, that's the life of Hugh Lofting. He died in the 1940s. He did not even live to see World War II, I don't believe. He died in 1947. Oh, never mind. So he lived through World War II. But still, he wasn't particularly old. I mean, he was 61. He died of psoriasis. So
no, cirrhosis.
Cirrhosis
of the liver. Psoriasis is like skin
that would be awful to die of that.
But you don't
My skin was so irritated I died.
It's like
cirrhosis. I'm sorry.
Psoriasis is kind of like eczema.
It was really bad eczema, Rebecca. Anyway, in the 1940s, he died of cirrhosis of the liver.
Not psoriasis.
So now that I've stumbled my way through his biography, Rebecca, why don't you tell us about the Voyages of Doctor Dolittle?
Okay. So the narrator is Tommy Stebbins, and he has a hurt squirrel that has been hurt by...
He's a child, by the way.
He's a child. he has this squirrel that's been hurt by a hawk, and he wants to help him. So his friend Matthew Mugg, the cat's meat man.
This book has amazing names, by the way.
Tells him about Dr. Dolittle, who can speak to animals. So he gets to Dr. Dolittle's house, and he meets all these animals that are really cool. Dr. Dolittle has this private zoo where there are locks on the doors, but from the inside. It's not to keep the animals in there, but it's to allow them to have their own privacy when they need it. It is not open to the public. It is not like a show. It's just a place where animals can live and be safe and happy in this fabulous garden and zoo.
Yeah, honestly, this house sounds amazing. Like,
Yeah.
Dr. Dolittle spends a not small amount of time in this book complaining about money and how much he hates money, but he must have a lot of money.
He must have a lot.
Or have inherited some money to have a house like this.
So, Tommy, something you should know about Tommy and his family is they are poor. They do not have the money to send Tommy to school, and Tommy has always watched the ships come in and out of the harbor or whatever, and has always wanted to travel with them. So he meets this doctor. The doctor helps his squirrel. They become fast friends, and they convince his parents to let Tommy go on a voyage with Dr. Dolittle because he will be he'll receive schooling there because Dr. Dolittle's going to teach him and all these things.
Well, isn't he going to be his apprentice first,
yes.
and then they decide to let him go on the voyage?
Yes. That is true. Regardless, there's a lot that happens in this book, so we're just gonna not
It's Rebecca's favorite kind of book, which is people traveling around on a boat, having episodic adventures.
So anyway, before they go, so Dr. Dolittle wants to go find Long Arrow, who is a Native American, who's the world's greatest naturalist. He can talk to eagles. And Dr. Dolittle, his whole motive, his goal throughout this book is he wants to learn the language of the shellfish. It is notoriously difficult language. The other animals think it's stupid. But he wants to learn the language of the shellfish, and he thinks Long Arrow can help him with this. So before they leave, Luke the Hermit is on trial for murder that happened in Mexico. And
it's not important to know who Luke the Hermit is.
No,
they barely
not.
explain who he is in this book.
I know.
So, I'm clarifying for our readers.
For
our
the
listeners.
Okay. So the doctor can speak to animals. There's only one witness that saw this murder happen, and it was Luke's dog. So the doctor convinces the judge to put the dog on the stand, and the dog gets Luke off, which I thought was a great scene, which we'll talk about that later. Anyway, so that happens before they leave.
A lot of stuff happens before they leave.
So they find out that Long Arrow has disappeared, and the last place that he was seen was Spider Monkey Island. So they play this little game to decide where are we going to go on our voyage. And lo and behold, the game said they should go to Spider Monkey Island. Sounds like a Ouija board to me. But regardless, they decided to go to Spider Monkey Island. Bumpo, who's an African prince that you supposedly met in the first book, which I did not read,
you definitely
comes
meet
along.
him in the first book.
And I know. But he comes along, and he joins them on the journey, as well as do several stowaways. But Dr. Dolittle doesn't want these stowaways, and so they get to the island of Penzance, and they kick the stowaways off, and I did not realize until I read the afterword that this is supposed to imply that they then become the pirates of Penzance.
Oh.
Did not realize that.
I did not realize that either.
Cute little tidbit there. So, along the way to Spider Monkey Island, they stop in the islands of Capablanca of Spain. And Dr. Dolittle is just so upset that they are still doing bullfighting, which good on him. And so he kind of tricks the bullfighters because they don't know he can speak to animals. He's like, if I win in the ring, you will stop doing bullfighting forever. Well, obviously he can talk to this bull, so he is able to tame him without bullfighting, and bullfighting ends forever, and they have to run out of the island because the people are going to try to kill him or whatever. So they get to Spider Monkey Island, and all I'm going to say is, well, no. So they find
I was gonna say it's tricky how they get to Spider Monkey Island because it's a floating island. That's the thing that's unique about it.
It is a floating island. They get there, and they discover this beetle with its name starts with a J. It's the type of beetle it is. Anyway, they meet this beetle, and this beetle has these pictures drawn on him on a little note, like it's tied up to him like a message in a bottle, but it's a message in a beetle. And the message lets the Doctor know that Long Arrow and his friends are trapped in this cave. So they get them out, they set them free, they help them escape, and they're the heroes. So basically, let me just sum up what happens on Spider Monkey Island. The Doctor teaches these poor, ignorant, indigenous peoples all of these things, and they just can't live without him. So they crown him king.
And you forgot he fought a war, too.
Listen, I said, yes, we're summing things up. He fights a war. Anyway. So he's crowned king. He doesn't want to be king. There's no way he can't be king. And then they meet the great glass sea snail, who's like this deep sea creature. Anyway, and they escape with the sea snail to go back to England, and it's time for tea. The end. That's the book.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff that happens in between, but we need to get on with
It's a hard book to summarize because it's like so much stuff happens, but it's not like a linear, like point A to point. Well, it is point A to point B, but there's not like connection between the different letters of the alphabet.
Right.
Point A to point B to point C.
Also, this book is so long. This book is long.
It's not as long as the story of mankind.
It is 7. Well, if that's our metric, but
it would have been at the time.
It has.
Had we read the story of mankind in 1922?
7 parts, you all. Anyway, what did you like about this book, Michael? This is a reread for Michael, a first read for me.
At least 20 years. Okay. It was a dim memory.
Tell us what you liked.
I remember really liking this book as a kid, and the things I remembered about this book are the things that I still enjoy. Like, I think I like. I just like the concept of speaking with animals. That's fun. And like this concept of like going on a quest that is not really a quest for anything but knowledge. Like that's fun. Like you're like, I want to figure out how to talk to shellfish. And it's like a typical adventure story where you're just trying to find something. But instead of like doing regular adventure things like treasure or something, it's like we're trying to learn things. And that sounds really didactic, but it's not actually a very didactic book. It's like that's like the excuse for the book to do all sorts of like funny and wacky things, and it just does kind of, I don't know, it tries on a lot of different modes, and I think some of them work and some of them don't, but like it's always moving on to something new. And I think as long as the book is, the pace is pretty brisk. Like you go from him, like Dr. Dolittle, like investigating a murder mystery to him, pranking the bullfighters in like not that long of time. There's like most of it's pretty comic in tone, and I think that works in some places better than others. But there are some places where it's kind of funny. Like Bumpo, the African prince, has come to England because he's studying at a school, and the name of the school's name, it's not Oxford, it's called Bulford. Because a bull,
they sent everybody else to Oxford. Why could he not go?
I don't remember, but like but there's like funny stuff like that throughout that are just kind of like, it's not like laugh out loud funny, but it's like amusing. I think some of the ideas are fun. Like one thing you don't mention is the sea snail that they go in, and they go back to to their home on the sea snail. He's a glass sea snail, which means that his shell is transparent. And so they go inside the shell, and he like scoots them along the ocean floor until they're back to one of the great names in this book, Puddleby on the Marsh, which is the name of the town they live in.
I also left out that he does achieve his goal of learning the language of the shellfish.
Yeah.
Because of this interaction with the sea snail. Anyway, continue.
Yeah. Anyway, like, I just think, like, the island that's floating is fun. Like, that's a fun idea that, like, there's this island, and the idea is that there's a big air pocket underneath it that's keeping it afloat. Like, that's a fun idea. I don't know. I just think like in all of these little incidents, there's something I enjoy in each of these incidents, and mostly the things I enjoy now are the things I remembered from as a kid. I remember like approaching this book. I was like, oh yeah, this is the book with the floating island, or this is the book where they ride the shellfish on the ocean floor, or this is the book where he talks to the bulls and doesn't. It's like Babe in the movie Babe, where he talks to the sheep and they do this amazing show that dumbfounds everyone. It's the same thing with the bullfight. Like I remembered all these things, and those things were the things that I still mostly enjoyed this time around. There's a sense of whimsy and just this idea of not taking itself very seriously that I think like makes the book go down easy, or at least does for me, and I appreciate that. Anyway, what did you like, Rebecca?
I think the premise is cute. I think the doctor is really, really nice, and he's passionate toward animals. I like that he hates bullfighting and the constriction of the zoos. I thought all of that was probably pretty advanced for his time, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah,
I still don't
know
see
what animal
people,
rights are like
right,
in the 1920s, but certainly a lot of people would not have had these views.
Right. So I also just think I'm glad that I know kind of how these stories started in like a really dark place in his life that was really scary, and he wanted to be connected to his kids, so he just invents this world that is very fun and exciting and totally different than what he's experiencing. I think all of that is really, really neat. My favorite scene, honestly, I love that trial of Luke the Hermit. I just thought that was really funny.
It is funny.
I thought it was funny. Like, it's so unbelievable, but also like it's not supposed to be anything but that. You know, it's like this doctor that is like putting this dog on the stand, and I just think,
well, and how he gets the dog to be on the stand, the judge is like, you can't talk to animals. Prove it to me. I'm going to bring in my dog.
And my dog's going to tell you what I ate for dinner. And then the dog tells him all these other, like, embarrassing things. The judge is like, okay, that's enough. Put the dog on the stand. I thought that scene was really cute and funny. And, like, I was interested in finding out what really happened with the murder. Honestly, my favorite parts of the book are in Puddle Beyond the Marsh. Like, I wish we would have spent more time there, but it's not that kind of book. It's like...
But also... I will say one thing I did not remember from this book. I read this on my Kindle, so I could see like percentages of the book. They don't depart from Puddle Beyond the Marsh until 40% of the way through the book. Like, I did not remember that they spent that long before they departed on their voyage. But it's quite a long time.
Yeah, and I will say, for as long as this book is, it doesn't really drag. It's just. There's a lot of little episodes, but, like, I appreciated that the chapters were short, so if, like, you got tired, you could stop. It's long, but it reads quicker than you think it would. I appreciate that it reads like a children's book, which some of the ones that we've read in the 20s have not read like a children's book.
Including, again, the Story of Mankind.
Yeah. Was Gay Neck 20s or 30s?
I think that was the end of the 20s, which also interesting. I mean, it makes sense given that this was like a, cataclysmic trauma for an entire generation. But like another book to come out of like World War One,
yeah,
and to be staunchly anti-war.
Yeah. So I just thought with other ones that we've read in the 20s that have like not really read like a children's book, this one actually did. So I liked all those things.
One thing I forgot to mention in the bio, I'm just going to mention now because you're done with your positives, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so this is a bit of a transition point, but I do want to mention, apparently, Hugh Lofting vaguely was inspired and based Dr. Dolittle off of an actual figure in real life who was not a naturalist but was a surgeon named John Hunter, who was a 18th century surgeon, British surgeon, who contributed a lot to medicine and the study of medicine in the West, I guess. He taught the person who created some early vaccines. His claim to fame is that he did the first the first recorded artificial insemination. But he did a lot of other cool stuff too, and some other not cool stuff doctors of this time tend to, like, doing experiments on people without their consent and things like that. But
especially if you're a person of color.
I don't know. It did not mention that on the brief skimming of Wikipedia that I did. But I do want to mention that, like, before we get to the negatives, which are going to come soon, like, one of the interesting things is that this book, which is another thing I had forgotten, but this book purports to be the recollections of Tommy as an adult, looking back on it. So he's an adult in the 1920s, looking back on Dr. Dolittle years and years ago. Like, I think Dr. Dolittle was supposed to take place in, like, the 1840s or something like that. Like, it's very early compared to when this book was written. And so, like, I think that Hugh Lofting is consciously setting Dr. Dolittle within that kind of early scientific revolution milieu. I guess by the early 19th century, it's not early science, but within the scientific revolution of, like, these kind of, like, iconoclastic, almost invariably men who were trying to be, like, innovators in their field and did so through, like, at least in the mythologized version of it, like, did so through, like, gumption and sheer intelligence. It did these experiments where they just contributed to human knowledge. And I think that, like, Dr. Dolittle as a character is meant to evoke that past, or at least that mythologized past. And I think that explains some of the problems that we're going to have with it in a second. Because Rebecca, why don't we start with you? What did you not like about this book?
Well, I just feel like I have to give a disclaimer. I don't think these are the reasons why I dislike this book, but I think I disliked it more than you because this is literally the book that I hate. Like, I don't know why, but I do not like books that feature heavily on a boat. I do not like Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Just on the boat the whole time. I don't know why. I have no good explanation of it. I also really hate books. This book does not do this. I really hate books that take a lot of time to explain to you the parts of the ship at the beginning of the book so you know what's going on.
The Voyage of the Dawn Treader
do not care. I don't care. Like, just, I don't need to know.
Well, in fact, there's a kind of funny scene in this book, in the Voyages of Dr. Dolittle, where this trained sailor comes up because they're looking for people to man this boat that they're going to take this voyage on. This trained sailor comes up. He's like, "Oh, you're doing this boat all wrong. You got to do this, this, and this." And Dr. Dolittle's like, "Get out of here, man. I don't want you."
I appreciate because Dr. Dolittle doesn't know anything about boats. He doesn't care anything about boats.
They don't even use, like, correct boat terminology or anything, which I think
I love.
Yeah.
So if you're going to write a book about boats, don't care about them, which is what he did.
It's like a plot point that they, like, kick off the expert. It's so funny.
And Tommy is, like, concerned. He's like, or one of the birds is concerned, or maybe both of them. They're like, it really is worth considering. Should we have someone that actually knows about seafaring or whatever it's called to be here? And they're like, no, it's not important. What's really funny is, like, after a shipwreck happens, I thought that was funny. The doctor, like, tied Tommy to part of the ship when he was asleep because there was, like, a storm and they were going to crash, and he wanted to just be able to, like, find that part of the ship later. And after the crash, while Tommy's floating in the sea and the bird goes find him, the doctor is just shaving on the part of the ship that he's on. It's funny. That's funny. Anyway, I don't like books about boats. I don't like voyages. I don't like episodes. And this book is all those things. It's a lot of those things, yeah. So, I'm just going to give that, like, disclaimer. This book is very, this book is a product of its time. And that's what I mean by that.
That's why I brought up earlier, like, what it's trying to evoke.
What I mean by that is it's very colonialist and it is very racist. And Michael and I actually read two different versions of this book. His is not technically abridged, but it has been, like, modified to take out some of the...
So, like, a history thing that we both found out is that the Dr. Dolittle books were allowed to go out of print for a couple decades in the 20th century. And people weren't really eager to revisit them because a lot of the parts, or at least some parts of it, like, were racist, like.
So my book had the N-word at least twice.
Yeah, so Rebecca had the uncut version, whereas my version was in the 1980s. Christopher Lofting authorized an editing and new printing of the books that he believed would have been in line with what his father would have wanted.
Let me say, when I say the N word is used, it's not like people are then chastised for that word being used. It's just like normal to call black people that. There was a female version of the word I had never read before that I learned in this book.
Interesting.
Anyway, so that's there.
Every day.
Black people are, there's like this little subplot that is in both books, but they changed the language a little bit in Michael's than they didn't in mine. Like there's a subplot about how the monkey, what's his name?
Chi-Chi.
Okay, I thought that was it, but I didn't. Okay, Chi-Chi, like, is on a ship and he meets these funny people that look like this girl that he, his cousin that he's in love with. And so he's like, oh, I could look like them. So he just puts a dress on and they think he's a little girl. Well, you can tell, if you read between the lines, that was a black family, these funny people. So they're saying that they look like monkeys.
Yeah, I think that we compared side by side my edited version of what this incident looked like and Rebecca's version. Because I didn't catch this, although like once Rebecca showed me, it seemed fairly obvious. They took out the description of the family as funny. Like he just looked at people on the boat and was like, "Oh, that person looks like one of my cousins."
So it's still problematic.
It's still problematic, but it signals less of like wink, wink.
Yeah.
This is supposed to be some black people that he thinks looks like his family.
And then Bumpo is like such a.
He's comic relief the whole book, and at the expense of his intelligence.
Right,
basically.
like he has, what do you call malapropisms? Is that how you say it?
Malaprops, yeah.
Malaprops. Like he mispronounces all these words, but trying to be, like you can tell the way that Lofting is writing this character is somebody that's been around educated people, educated white people. And so he's trying to use these like $1 million words and keeps messing them up the whole time. There's like I think there's some comments about him like suggesting cannibalism at some point.
There is, because the stowaway, one of the stowaways is the boat expert.
Yeah.
And he eats all their food and they're like, what are we going to do for food? And he's like, and Bumpo's like, can we just eat him? And the parrot thinks that's a great idea, by the way.
Right. Well, no, I think it says you can't do that.
The parrot's like, you can't do that, but that is a great idea.
Okay. So anyway, and then when they get to Spider Monkey Island with the indigenous peoples, it's just very condescending. They're portrayed as these ignorant natives that don't know about fire. They don't know about anything. They're just going to die if the doctor doesn't, do something and teach them these things. And so it's just, it's a product of its time. And this is the type of book that I don't particularly enjoy. And so that is what I disliked.
I also dislike those things, except for the boat stuff. I don't mind books. But, and I read the first Dr. Dolittle book as a child, and then I read this one. I have not read any other Dr. Dolittle books, neither as a child nor growing up. And I remember my dad, in the first Dr. Dolittle book, that's the one that people really ding for being racist. Like, a lot of the stuff that we talked about here is kind of ambient racism, like how characters are portrayed or whatever. It's not really inherent to the plot of the book, except maybe some of the stuff on Spider Monkey Island. But most of it is like, just comments that characters make or descriptions are kind of like they have this kind of colonialist view of like other people who aren't British. And that's what's racist about this book. Whereas in the first book, Bumpo is an antagonist. When Dr. Dolittle goes to Africa and is like captured by him, and there's this whole plot that's like really awful, involving like Bumpo wants to be white because this woman he loves is only interested in white men, and so Dr. Dolittle like tricks Bumpo into saying like he's this great doctor who can turn him white, and so he just like paints his face white, and then Bumpo's like so happy to be white that they let Dr. Dolittle go. It's just kind of like horrible like pranking somebody based along like racial lines, and like I remember my dad saying like that's not a really nice thing that he does, and like that's racist and all that. And I didn't have the wherewithal as a child to kind of recognize how in this book, even though what happens to the characters is not inherently that racist, like it is still from that kind of colonialist mindset of like here's the thing, like everyone who is not Dr. Dolittle is like less intelligent and needing his help in some way. And that's not in and of itself like a colonialist mindset, except that he is doing so as he is traveling across the world. Like even Long Arrow, who Dr. Dolittle respects as his great naturalist, and like the book is very like, lavishing praise on how brilliant Long Arrow is as a naturalist. But Dr. Dolittle has to save Long Arrow, and then Long Arrow like becomes his servant. And it's just this kind of like glorified idea of like when it's in that context, like him being compared to these kind of like scientific forebears, or being inspired, by these scientific forebears makes a lot of sense, because a lot of those came at the same time as like colonialism and all that, and like the people that like were praised for being great explorers or great contributors to human knowledge often did so at the behest of colonialism, or at the expense of people who were colonized. And that's not like true across the board, but as a principle, it kind of is. And so, like, I think like Hugh Lofting is like ingesting that as like, oh well, in order to tell the story of this great naturalist, he must travel abroad, and of course, since he's a great naturalist, he must teach everyone else about all these things. And I don't know, like, I didn't like that about the book, but it is really interesting as a case study, because it's like benevolent racism. Like, you can tell that Hugh Lofting thinks that this is some great enlightened book. And like we mentioned, especially with animals, it is very like, feels forward thinking even today, like a ethical zoo like that, like that's not something that we would do now. And I don't know, like I wrote down a few things because I read a little bit about this, that Hugh Lofting in his like professional life as a writer, like was very open about being like actually anti-racist, and how like racism and national allegiance were things that caused great pain and suffering. And it makes sense coming out of like World War I specifically, some of this stuff, like especially with national allegiance, but racism too. Like there's this quote that was in the foreword of the book that Rebecca, the copy of the book Rebecca had, and that where Hugh Lofting was quoted as writing in The Nation, the magazine The Nation, as saying this, like, quote, "If we make children see that all races, given equal physical and mental chances for development, have about the same batting average of good and bad, we shall have laid another very substantial foundation stone in the edifice of peace and internationalism." And it's kind of like an interesting failure of the book then, that he had this very clearly articulated belief that like there is no inherent good or bad races, but that he unintentionally transposes a kind of like British colonial mindset that kind of patronizes people who aren't British. And it's not just the indigenous people, not just Bumpo. There's also a fairly unflattering depiction of a Mexican earlier on in the murder trial. He's like the kind of stereotype of like the shifty Mexican who double crosses you or whatever. Like, I don't know. It's just like interesting to think about like, the ways in which you can just, I'm assuming he's sincere in this, like be completely unintentional in being racist just because of, and people use the product of its time as sometimes a way to hand wave away problems with older stuff. And I'm not using it in that sense. Like these are still problems, because, whether or not this was just the default view of its time, British colonial mindset, resulted in some very terrible things, done toward these people who were colonized. But it is truly a product of his time in the sense of, because it was his time, he did not realize that these depictions were out of step with the ideology he professed to have.
Well, and I think it's also important that when you hear people say that, you have to question what they mean by equal physical and mental chances. Because if you view those positive, like physical and mental chances through a white lens, you're going to view everyone that hasn't had that same like experience or cultural values or any of that as inferior or not having You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, the Spider Monkey Island people are a great example of this,
Right.
where there's kind of this whole thing about how these people don't have fire as a technology. And I tried to Google, like, are there, like, contemporary people groups who don't use fire? You know, because there's still, like, nomadic peoples in, like, Africa and you know, in Central and South America and stuff. And I was like, is this a real thing? And I can't tell, but there are all sorts of civilizations that didn't have some of the technologies that we would consider essential to the advancement, quote unquote, of society. Like some very powerful and otherwise technologically advanced societies didn't have like the wheel, for instance. And so, like, I think it's a worthwhile thought experiment to say, like, well, what if people didn't have fire? What would they be like? But he doesn't. Lofting, all he basically uses that as saying is these are these poor, helpless people who must be saved with technology that this man can bring. And I'm
also
not,
like if his skill is that he can talk to animals, like that's how he could have helped the natives and it just been like fine. Like, but instead they can't do anything.
right. And
They're
so that's
not
what I
good
mean is
cooks. They don't know how to use their land. Like it's just
it's a poor understanding of how people groups can be different while not being inferior. Because like
Right.
basically what I'm getting from this quote about how, you know, they have the same opportunities to do good and bad or whatever, there's an unassumed, or, you know, connecting that with this book, there is an assumption being made that that which is most like, you know, kind of quote unquote civilized British society is the good. And so these people on Spider Monkey Island who don't have fire, I mean, I like fire. I like living with heating and stuff. But there are all sorts of societies that live without things that I would consider essential, and those societies are fine, and they shouldn't.
and
They
they're
shouldn't
innovative.
need. They shouldn't need to. Right. There's all sorts of ways that societies can be innovative, and so I guess like if there is a civilization that is without a technology, I'm not saying that civilization shouldn't be given access to that technology, but the way that it's presented in this book is these people will die if they don't get fire. And the reason for that, there's a plot contrivance, is that the island is floating further south and they're going to freeze to death. And like I get, like if you're in a more temperate climate, like it doesn't matter. But we don't see, like it talks about them eating food raw and stuff, like just being miserable because they can't cook food and stuff. And like how, I don't know, like there are so many different ways that human cultures have adapted across the world that in ways that like without resources that we would consider essential, you know, from a kind of, you know, our own points of view, it is like a failure of imagination by Hugh Lofting that he can't conceive of these native populations as living in any other way. And also like the forward in your version of the book points this out too. The depiction of the natives in the illustrations, as well as like how they're depicted, doesn't actually match what natives are like in like indigenous people in South America are like, which is where they're supposed to be from, like off the coast. Like the basically he's taken the stereotypes about Great Plains Indians, you know, like Geronimo and like Apache and that sort of thing, and just transposed it because that's again, if I think a failure of imagination to understand how. Oh, just because they're Native American doesn't mean that they're like how movies. Well, I don't know if he was watching movies in the 1920s, but how, you know, media, you know, has kind of stereotyped all American natives as being those that we had conflict about at that time, you know, on the Great Plains. Anyway, it's a long way of saying we're kind of going long here, but I didn't like those things about the book, and they kind of put a damper on the book for me. But it's interesting. I don't know. I think it's maybe a call to humility. Like, you know, you can have really high-minded ideas, but still be in some way beholden to unintentional biases and stuff like that. Like it's just worth. It's, you know, it's worth considering, and I think it's one of the reasons why, which is actually a theme in Dr. Dolittle books. Like communication and learning about other people groups is so key, is that it exposes your biases. And you know, for as much as Hugh Lofting is forward thinking about animals or whatever, he clearly doesn't know very much about Africa or the Americas in terms of its indigenous populations.
Yeah.
And that's really apparent, and you know, kind of makes some not so great things happen.
Yeah.
That said,
did you decide on thumbs up or
well,
thumbs
hold on.
down?
I know I'm going really long here, but we talked for like 15 minutes or something about this specific thing, but this is not actually what made me dislike some parts of the book the most. Like, I was kind of expecting, like, 1920 is like, there's probably going to be some stuff I didn't remember that was, not great. But I actually found the prose really readable, and it was readable, but I also found it kind of dull at times. And I don't know, some of the cool stuff that I remembered, which I like the concept of, I kind of forgot that they get kind of, it doesn't feel like they're executed with as much imagination as I remembered. Like, for instance, going in the sea snail, there's like a page where they're like going on the ocean floor, and it doesn't really tell you anything about the ocean floor.
It doesn't tell you anything about what they see.
That's so weird. Like, it's like the most, like, Dr. Dolittle is apparently writing pages and pages of stuff he observes, but they don't come up with any cool stuff for them on the ocean floor. Like, you can contrast that with, like, Jules Verne, who's very much in the same vein of Dr. Dolittle in terms of exploring and that kind of, like, Victorian mindset sort of stuff. When they go undersea, they see, like, Atlantis and the giant squids and, all sorts of stuff in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. But in this, they just kind of, like, in a page, like, yeah, we saw some stuff, and then we're back at Puddleby on the Marsh. And that's just kind of disappointing that there's that. And that was the case for a lot of this book, whereas, like, I remember this happening in the book, but I don't know if my mind filled in more details or what, but I remember this book felt weirdly spare to me in a way that I didn't remember, and made some of the cool concepts not feel as fully realized. And honestly, that was I don't know what this says about me, but that was as much of a damper on my enjoyment of this book as the kind of problematic, like, colonial stuff. It wasn't as much as I said I liked some of the fun stuff, it wasn't as fun as I remembered. And maybe it's just me being, 20, 25 years older and just being more jaded or having higher expectations than I did as a kid. But I don't know.
So what'd you decide?
I'm kind of torn about this because there's still things that I like about it. It's not a complete negative, but
there's always things that we like about the books.
Not always. I don't know. I think I said this earlier when we were talking about Free Water, how
you had no problem.
Sometimes, well, that's what I'm saying is sometimes when I'm waffling on something, I'm like, well, I'll default to positive, and I think I'm going to say a thumbs down, which really surprised me. I truly enjoyed that book as a child, and I was anticipating enjoying it this time around with maybe a more adult lens when it comes to some of the colonialist stuff that I was kind of expecting. But I think thumbs down because the combination of the racism stuff and just the fact, like I said a minute ago, like, it kind of feels flatter and smaller than I remembered it being.
Yeah.
And it's just like returning to a house you grew up in. Everything seems smaller, I guess. But I don't know. I've returned to other books that I read as children in this series, and my enjoyment of it was usually at least the same.
Yeah.
And this is the first one I've returned to, and I'm like, man, I don't know that I really like this book that much anymore.
Well, I'm sorry for you in that. I know that's kind of disappointing, but I am happy that we are in agreement. I also give this book a thumbs down.
Yeah.
But I was able to find parts that I enjoyed about it. And when I first started reading, I was like, oh no, I didn't think I was going to find anything. And so anyway, there we go.
Yeah. Well, this is going to be our longest podcast in a while. So we'll go ahead and wrap up quickly. Next time on the Newbery Chronicles, we're in the 1930s.
We're reading The Cat Who Went to Heaven
by Elizabeth Coatsworth. Who knows what we'll have to say about the racial dynamics of this book, because it's set in Japan,
guys.
It's set in Japan, but the woman's last name is Coatsworth.
Well, because she was a missionary in Japan.
Oh.
So, yeah.
Well, I'm sure that
she
has an enlightened view of the Japanese culture. Anyway, 1931 is when that book won the Newbery Medal. So if you have any feedback for us, newberychronicles@gmail.com. Otherwise, that's all.
Thanks for listening.